Have you ever seen the movie Joe versus the Volcano? Now, I haven't seen that movie in a long time. It was released in like 1990. From what I can remember, though, Joe, played by Tom Hanks, was in a dead-end job. He was unhappy. Now, he was about to have the adventure of his life, but at the beginning of the movie, he didn't know that. And as he comes into the office one day, his boss is on the phone. Now, this is before cell phones, of course. Joe's taking off his coat. He's getting some coffee. He's getting ready to start his workday. But in the background, we hear his boss on this phone call. And over and over and over again, we hear his boss say the same thing. He's like, "Harry, I know he can get the job, but can he do the job? Harry, I know he can get the job, but can he do the job?" And then Harry says something, on the other end. And the boss actually comes in, "I'm not arguing that with you. I'm not arguing that with you. Look, Harry, I know he can get the job, but can he do the job? I'm not arguing that with you. I'm not arguing that with you." Right? And it goes on for 5 minutes. It's really hysterical. If you've never seen that movie, you got to watch it. Joe versus the Volcano. So this is the question you're asking. What does that have to do with the Sermon on the Mount? That's a great question. Sometimes when I'm talking to people about Jesus, the Bible, and the church, I feel like I'm living out that scene. So I hear certain people complaining about the church or Christians, and I find myself actually agreeing with them. And I'm like, you know what? I'm not arguing that with you. I agree with you, And it immediately diffuses the tension. And then they actually want to hear more. You see, everybody seems to have a picture in their mind about what God is like, what Christians are like, what they should be like, what the church is like, what the church should be like. And that picture in their mind is most likely based on their own experience. Now, they might have gone to church as a kid, they might have visited a church as an adult, or they might have never gone to church, but they know people who have, and or they might have grown up in a particular church or denomination. And so at some point, we all have formed an opinion of what the church is supposed to be like, right? And what God and the Bible are all about. And that opinion might be right or it might be wrong. And I also confess that as a child growing up, and even as a young adult, I had a picture in my mind of what church was like, and it was based on my own experience. And so I think we all might be guilty at times of thinking, based on our own limited experience, that we know what it is, or that all churches and all Christians are the same. Some of us might even have been guilty of thinking our church was right and everyone else was wrong. And I will admit, it took many years for me to unlearn some things that I thought I already knew about God, the Bible, Jesus, the church, and other denominations. And so that's where we're headed with the Sermon on the Mount. In fact, I believe that's the whole setup to the Sermon on the Mount in general. Jesus was about to deliver one of his most famous sermons. And in doing that, he was about to alienate half of his audience. So half of his audience was going to hate him because he was about to say the opposite of what they believed. And it was going to go against everything they thought they knew. And then the other half was about to have a new best friend in Jesus because he was going to rock their spiritual world in a very good way. And all of a sudden, the people that thought they were not good enough, they thought they were unclean, they thought that somehow they didn't belong, now they're about to belong. The outcasts were about to become part of the in crowd just like that. And shockwaves were about to go through the land of Israel. And in case you're wondering, the super religious people, the people that thought they were better than everybody else, were the ones who were about to be on the outside looking in. They thought they knew, but they didn't know. They thought they were the best thing since sliced bread, but they were about to find out that they were not. So I want all of us to just open up our minds. Let's take what we think we know about God, the church, and the Bible, and just put it on the shelf. I want us all to come to this series with an open mind and be ready to unlearn some things we think we already know. So here we go. Here's the first 2 verses of Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 to 2. It says, "Seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him, and he opened his mouth and taught them, saying." Now, No one knows for sure exactly where this sermon was given, but given the context, we know that it was somewhere along the shore of the Sea of Galilee, which is in modern-day Israel. The traditional site where it is believed this took place is on a mountain on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. It's close to his hometown of Capernaum, and it overlooks the Sea of Galilee. In fact, there's a Catholic church standing on top of that mountain today, and tourists visit it all the time. I had the privilege of visiting the site twice now, when I went to Israel way back in 2009 and then in 2023. Although if you do go to Israel, you realize there's a bunch of mountains surrounding the Sea of Galilee, so it could have been almost anywhere along that body of water. No one knows for sure. All we know, according to this verse, is that Jesus went up on the mountain. We don't know which one, but we know he went up on the mountain. And we know that he sat down to teach his disciples. And this is like one of my favorite parts. When I first started teaching and preaching, I always stood up. I usually stood behind a pulpit. And I did that because that's what everybody else did, right? I didn't know any better. But at some point, I decided to make myself a little more comfortable. So I'm pretty sure that from the beginning of my first church plant is where I started sitting on a stool to preach. I didn't have a nice table like this in front of me, but I sat on a stool to preach and teach, and I did that for about 10 years. And now I don't always get to sit and teach anymore, but that is my preferred method. You see, at that time, that was actually more of the norm. We have it backwards today. So if a teacher during Jesus' lifetime on earth sat down to teach, it was considered an official and authoritative teaching. If Jesus would have stayed standing, it would have been considered less formal and not official. And since I consider this teaching an official time of teaching, I like to sit down. So there you go. But we'll mix it up for you during this series. But I said all of that to say that what Jesus was about to teach was a big deal. And based on what he said and based on the variety of subjects that he taught here, some scholars think that what we have here is just a summary of what Jesus said and not everything. Some of those same scholars think that this sermon might have even gone on for a few days rather than a few minutes. And they also think that given the similarity of this sermon with a similar one in the book of Luke, that this is a message he probably taught more than once. And I don't disagree with that. Same with a lot of his parables, other things that he taught. He probably taught them many, many times over the course of his ministry. That's why I don't mind taking 9 weeks plus this bonus 5-day devotional video to dissect what he's teaching here rather than trying to shove it all in one message. There's just so much he says during the sermon, there's no possible way we can all get it out and or digest it in 45 minutes or less. Even with the first section we're looking at here, it's hard to do it in one message. There's just so much packed in here. It's just unbelievable in a good way. But this first section here is called the Beatitudes. I'm sure you've heard that before, but what in the world is a beatitude? Now that is an unfortunate title. Actually, we get our English word beatitude from a Latin word, beatus, and that word simply means blessed. So instead of calling this the Beatitudes, we should really call it the blessings. I've said this before and I'll say it again. The Old Testament was written primarily in Hebrew with a few smidges of Aramaic, and the New Testament was written in Greek. It was the Catholic Church that insisted everything be in Latin, and that's a whole other sermon series. I don't want to go down that rabbit trail. We'll just leave it at that. But Latin really has no business in our purposes here. The word that's used here in Greek, makarios, simply means blessed. And these blessings are basically what God wants us to be in our everyday lives. So when we read blessed are the blank and blessed are the blank, blessed are the blank, it's simply a new way of looking at our lives. This is who God wants us to be, the be attitudes, right? These are the attitudes he wants us to have toward the way he wants us to be, the way he wants us to live our lives. And if we adopt these ways of being, we will be blessed. But we won't just be blessed generically. We're going to be blessed by God. But a lot of these are going to be the opposite of what we think we know. So let's dive in here. Let's get started with the first blessing here. Beginning in verse 3, here's what it says. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So what does it mean to be poor in spirit? We all know what it means to be physically poor, either by experience or by existing in this consumer-driven culture. And sometimes we take for granted all the blessings we have that many people across the globe don't have. And so we might say we're poor, but we're really not. We might think we're poor because we can't afford all the comforts we'd like to have, but we're really rich, since most of us don't ever really worry about where our next meal is coming from, or having a roof over our heads, or having clothes to wear. And I'm guilty of that. I say I'm poor all the time, but it's only because of my own selfishness. I have everything I need. And even if I don't, I can usually get it within a short amount of time. All of us here in America can. We all have access to Amazon and Walmart. And that's something to be thankful for. But we all know the definition of poor. We know physically what that means, even if we've never personally experienced it. But what does it mean to be poor in spirit? And how can we be blessed if that's the case? What is Jesus talking about here? What he's talking about here, I believe, is humility and total dependence on God, which is actually a positive and not a negative. Although, if we are poor in spirit, we might be feeling pretty down. We might be feeling exhausted. We might be feeling burnt out. We might feel like we have nothing left in the tank spiritually, emotionally, or mentally. We might feel like we have nothing left to give. But based on what's coming here in this Sermon on the Mount, I believe Jesus is making a contrast here with those who think they're all that in a bag of chips spiritually. Those aren't the ones who are blessed. The ones who are blessed are the poor in spirit. Just because some people have outside success that you can see doesn't necessarily mean they're blessed by God. I was speaking to a pastor friend of mine one time who had to shut down his church plant. And on the surface, it's easy to get down about that. It's easy to think that it was a failure, or that somehow he did something wrong, or that God just wasn't in it, right? You've all heard that before. But what if it was just all a part of God's plan, right? What if he's done some amazing things in people's lives, and now it's simply time for God to send that pastor somewhere else because he has another assignment for him? And so I actually felt a bit inspired listening to him talk over the phone. I was the one who wanted to talk, to offer some encouragement to him, but in the end, I was the one who was encouraged. I was the one who was blessed. He had a very healthy way of looking at God's will. And he made some excellent points about following God's lead. And he felt like God was just now leading him in a direction that he did not originally expect, but he's totally on board with. He was okay with it. He was at peace with it. And he's trusting God through the process instead of thinking that he did anything wrong or that somehow he failed. And by the way, it is okay to fail sometimes. And I'm not saying that he was poor in spirit in a negative way. It was actually very positive. He was humble about it. He was totally trusting God for what was next. And Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Now, to us on the surface, that's kind of unsettling, right? But to God, he just wants us to trust him in the process and give him the glory. It's not about our glory. It's not about our fame or success. It's all about God and his glory. And if we're on board with that, we are truly blessed by God. And the fact that he says theirs is the kingdom of heaven makes sense here, because the riches of heaven and our relationship with God are what the poor in spirit hold on to. It's what keeps us going. Many poor on earth look forward to winning the lottery someday, right? Every once in a while, we'll buy a lottery ticket. I confess, every once in a while it gets to like $500 gajillion. We try to win, even though deep down I know we're not going to win. I can't even get more than one number, if one number. It's just not going to happen. But if we're talking about being poor in spirit, we do have quite a jackpot waiting for us in heaven one day to look forward to. We do have a legitimate hope. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Pray about that today.